when training a model, if the quality of the training data is not good, then it's basically going to be garbage in, garbage out. So thinking about human in the loop, thinking about reinforcement learning with human feedback, thinking about other techniques, machine learning techniques like direct preference optimization and so forth, thinking about ground truth label data. These are some of the things that organizational leaders should keep in mind.
Can artificial intelligence truly reshape entire industries, or is it just another buzzword? What if the key to the future of AI lies in how we handle AI and data today? Welcome to Care to Lead podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Corsetti. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Manas Talukdar, Director of Engineering at Labelbox. It's a company that's at the forefront of transforming how organizations create and manage training data for AI applications. Manas is an expert in the intersection of AI and data science, and he's here to share how his insights on how AI is not just disrupting industries, but reshaping them in ways we might not even fully grasp yet. Manas, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cynthia. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right in. In your article, you talk a little bit about the critical role of data in the development and effectiveness of AI systems. Can you share more about why the quality of data is so crucial?
Sure. So data is basically the fuel that runs AI. So to be more specific, what that means is we have all these, for example, if you consider these large language model-based systems like say ChatGPT or Gemini that Google provides and so forth, they're all trained on massive data sets. So the quality of the output from these large language models has a direct correlation on the quality of the training data that these models are fed. And this is very apparent when you look at all the large language models that's out there today, because they have pretty much been trained on the same or similar data that's publicly available on the internet. If you ask a very generic question, the difference in answer between these LLMs is not going to be too much. I mean, you'd be splitting hairs to find too much of a difference. And that's because they have all been trained on pretty much the same data. So as with any machine learning model, similar to any AI system, following a large language model, the quality of the output has a direct correlation to the quality of the training data.
Okay, so I'm gonna spin this a little bit and ask you then, as a director of engineering, how do you lead your teams into creating systems that they make sure they get the best data? Because leaders in all industries whose teams are trying to get into using AI and do things, making sure that data is accurate and perfect is going to be a challenge. So what do you suggest for leaders?
So it is, as I said, it's very important to make sure that when training any machine learning model, the quality of the training data is paramount. And this question is actually a very good segue from what we were just discussing as part of your first question, because as I said earlier, basically all these large LLMs, they're using the same publicly available data off of the internet. And the problem they're all running into right now is that they have basically run out of data to be able to train their models. In fact, I was watching a conference from Meta, I think 3 or 4 weeks back, and the VP of AI Infra said in the conference that they have run out of freely available data. So now they're looking for synthetic data to train their models. So when any organizational leader is thinking about how to train their models, they should be laser focused on ground truth label data, in my opinion. Because at this point in time, the key differentiator in which LLM is performing better in terms of quality output, quality inference compared to another LLM is the quality of the training data. And specifically about that, it's the quality of the ground truth label data. To dive a little bit deeper, there is a dire need right now in the industry for very specialized label data. So think about, say, atmospheric data, which means, say, satellite imagery, which is labeled by people who have specific expertise in atmospheric science, or say, for example, X-rays being labeled by cardiologists and so forth. So ground truth label data should be paramount in any organizational leader when you're thinking about training models, and specifically when you're thinking about training large language models.
Data is changing constantly and growing. So what are some of the challenges in scaling AI solutions?
So scaling AI solutions would be, say, how to control compute cost, how to control inference cost. Right now, GPU compute cost is still pretty high, in my opinion. As a consequence of that, the development of these large LLMs is constrained and limited to a very few large organizations, basically trillion-dollar companies. Yes, there are other companies out there who are developing their own machine learning models, but they were nowhere close to the size and scale of the large LLMs being developed by, say, the OpenAIs, the Metas, or the Googles of the world. So scale is, when thinking about scale, GPU compute cost is extremely important. The other important aspect is being able to generate these large amounts of internet scale ground truth label data. And that's where the organization I work for, the company I work for, comes in, and other players like us in the industry, where we are able to operate at very large scale and generate huge amounts of high quality ground truth label data. The other part is that leaders should be aware of is making sure that there's human in the loop when training LLMs, because human in the loop, or thinking about the more technical term, reinforcement learning with human feedback, is becoming more and more important, especially when we think about the industry starting to veer towards synthetic data for training models. Because when training a model, if the quality of the training data is not good, then it's basically going to be garbage in, garbage out. So thinking about human in the loop, thinking about reinforcement learning with human feedback, thinking about other techniques, machine learning techniques like direct preference optimization and so forth, thinking about ground truth label data. These are some of the things that organizational leaders should keep in mind.
Tell me, let's talk a little bit more about your company that you work for, is Labelbox. Tell us more about them and what their mission is and what your clients look like.
Well, Labelbox is a mid-stage startup. We've been around for a few years now. So what we do is we help AI labs and enterprises build machine learning models. So we help enterprises build task-specific custom models. So think about, say, maybe an agricultural company wants to build a machine learning model that's able to detect weeds in drone images of their agricultural fields. They can use our platform to generate ground truth label data to train their models to do that. Or say maybe a robotic surgery company wants to train their model to do a better job in doing robotic surgery, and they can use our platform in order to do that. So that's one aspect of our business. The other aspect is working with AI labs to develop more and more powerful multimodal large language models. And we enable them to do that by providing them the ability to generate ground truth label data at very large scale. We also provide specialized talent who can generate ground truth label data for some of the use cases I mentioned, like, for example, atmospheric science, or say cardiologists generating ground truth label data for X-rays, or perhaps a nuclear physicist doing that for radiation images and so forth. So these are the things the company I work for, we're focused on. And answering your other question there, we work with some of the large AI labs out there, including some of the names I mentioned previously.
How many employees do you have at this time?
We have over 100 employees.
And I'm assuming they're probably mostly remote everywhere?
We are a hybrid company. What that means is, people can work from anywhere, but we are focused on a hub-based culture. So we have a bunch of people around our San Francisco headquarters. We also have a bunch of people around New York. We also have a bunch of people around our office, our remote office in Poland.
So I'm assuming then, as a director, you're supervising, you have direct reports. Tell me some of the challenges that you find in leading remote teams and hybrid teams.
Well, I think the challenges between remote and hybrid teams are similar and unique in their own way. So for remote teams, the challenge is making sure that people feel that they're part of the team, and especially if the people are distributed across different time zones, then making sure that there is enough coherence and alignment in terms of when people work together. So the goal here is to maximize the amount of time people can work together, because I might have a project where I have an engineer here in San Francisco. Meanwhile, I have an engineer working out of, say, Warsaw in Poland. Mm-hmm. So it's important to make sure that they're able to maximize the amount of time they spend together. That's one. The other aspect is that people shouldn't feel the need that, hey, I need to be up at some ungodly hour so that I'm responding to questions or responding to maybe a pull request review from my teammate who's in a different time zone in a different continent. So having this asynchronous communication format, which a modern technology enables really well, and making sure that myself as the organizational leader, I am signed in and I am giving that psychological safety to the people in my organization that yes, you can asynchronously collaborate. That's important. With hybrid, I think it works a little bit better than remote, because when we are hybrid, specifically thinking about, say, the people who are focused around a hub, we work remotely, we work from our home offices. At the same time, we also come into the office every so often. So we get the best of both worlds. So I really like that, because I go to the office, a couple times a week. So I get to meet my coworkers. I get to get that in-person interaction. And at the same time, I also get the flexibility of being able to work from home. And talking a little about my own personal experiences, I have worked for companies that have been overwhelmingly in office for almost all my career until I joined Labelbox. So I have been kind of, ingrained into an in-office culture. So I do like the in-person interaction. I like going to the office. So I appreciate that I'm able to go into the office every so often, talk to my coworkers, talk to my manager, talk to people in other organizations within the company, while at the same time, I can also work remotely from my home office, also here in the Bay Area.
Did you find it challenging to get the time management and focus and work hours really structured well when you started working at home from working in an office all the time?
That's a really good question. So I think I ran into this situation when COVID hit, when, working from home became a mandate for everyone. It was very difficult for me, and I think for a lot of people in the industry at that time, to figure out, okay, when exactly does work end and when does my own personal life start? It took a little bit of adjusting at that time, but I think that experience of 1 year working from home during COVID, that kind of helped me ease into my role here at Labelbox, where we're a hybrid culture. But to your point, I still like going to the office every so often. So I appreciate that I have that option here at Labelbox.
I've been working at home well before COVID, because I've been doing this since 2011. So I was working from home for a very long time. And I think what I've discovered over all these years is that there's really no such thing as work-life balance. Instead, it's more of a work-life flow. So your morning may be really tied up with work stuff, but then you may need some time in the afternoon to take care of some things in your life. Right. And then you come back in the evening and you're tied up with things at work. So the key becomes being able to give 100% to whatever activity that you're in, right, and learning to flow easily between those. And I think that's important when it comes to learning to keep remote employees engaged.
Right. I think that's an excellent way to put it. I mean, speaking from my own experience, and especially in the tech industry, I like to tell this to a lot of my employees, particularly when I hire people. I kind of check to see their cultural fit this way, among other things, that working in tech is not a 9-to-5 job. Sometimes it can be 9 to 5. Sometimes it can be 9 to 2, where, okay, I'm done in the early afternoon and I can perhaps take it easy for the rest of the day. Sometimes it can also be the 9 to the other 2, where I'm working really late at night. So again, it's more about getting things done. It's more about finding out when I can focus. Some people like to focus late at night. That's fine. And I tell my employees as well that I don't expect somebody to spend glued to the laptop, glued to the computer from a particular period in time within the day. At the end of the day, what matters is getting work done and delivering on commitments, and how people make it happen, that's up to them. And especially with remote and hybrid cultures, that is even more important.
I agree with you 100%. And sometimes it is challenging for leaders who get wrapped up in like their own time zone. If I'm on the East Coast or the West Coast, right, and I'm in my time zone, and like I often forget I have a client in Beijing, and I'm all pumped and it's early morning. I'm ready for a call, and it's like late in the evening for him, and he's respectfully been kind enough to get on that call with me. And, he may not be as energetic as I am at that time because his focus time was like 5 hours ago or 6 hours ago. So I think it's important as leaders to try to remember that and try to be flexible. And sometimes leaders struggle with that. They want everybody to be available when they're available, and they want response when they want response. And the key is to really focus on results, not how to get from point A to point B.
Right. We completely agree with that. Key is outcome, key is results, key is impact, not how much time somebody spent on their laptop.
So as an AI expert here, let's talk a little bit about some of the ethical considerations in AI. How do you approach ethical leadership in AI?
So that is a really important topic. So that can take many forms. So when we talk about ethical concerns, it can be a question about privacy. It also can be a question about bias in AI systems. So the way that's being tackled, there's multiple ways it's being tackled. In the interest of time, I'll probably touch upon a very few of them. So when you talk about privacy, one key way of addressing that is anonymization. So when AI is being trained, making sure that any personally identifiable information is being accurately anonymized as part of the training data itself. And there are algorithms that do that really well. So that's one aspect of it. Now let's talk a little bit about bias. So bias, what can that mean? It could mean perhaps that the training data set itself is not representative of our population. So that can be tackled by making sure that we have adequate representation in the training data set. Now, realistically, that may not always be possible. And then there are some machine learning techniques that can be used. So for example, there's techniques such as adversarial debiasing, there's techniques such as decoupled classification and so forth. And then there's another technique that name slips my mind. It's very interesting, where you use the endpoint of training for one particular demographic as the starting point for training for another demographic. So for example, if say a data set has 90% men and 10% women, then you don't train the AI model by saying that, hey, here's only 10% representation of women. You actually kind of, quote unquote, fool the AI model into thinking that, hey, you have had representation of women in the preceding 90% of the men demographic as well. I forget the exact name of the technique, but it's a machine learning technique that can be used. So there are these machine learning techniques. But in my personal experience, when the rubber hits the road, really what makes a difference is having ground truth label data. So that goes into making sure that we have adequate representation of people in the data sets. And sometimes what we have to do is, if that doesn't exist, then we also need to generate synthetic data. And now synthetic data is a tricky aspect here, because if synthetic data is incorrect, then the machine learning inference is going to be incorrect as well. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. So making sure that there's human in the loop in synthetic data generation is extremely important. So privacy, we talked about privacy, we talked about bias, and then other things are, in terms of making sure that AI systems are not being used for generating malicious content. So in my opinion, there's two ways one can tackle that. One way is that you have guardrails in place, so that, and without going into specifics, a particular big tech company actually, they did that with their large language models, where they had guardrails where when me as a user, when I'm prompting the large language model, they would intercept that and see what exactly am I prompting. They would also intercept that when the model has actually inferred something, and then make sure that it's not inferring something malicious. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is making sure that there's enough checks and balances, there's enough incentives for people to not misuse AI systems, and making sure that when malicious actors indeed misuse, there's legal remedies in place.
So you use the term synthetic data.
Yes.
And I want to unpack that a little bit, because my mind went immediately to an old quote by Kellyanne Conway, I think in the political realm, and she called something alternative facts. So share with me more about what synthetic data is.
So let's say we have a data set, a real data set. Okay, let's say employees at Labelbox. Now that is a very real data set, because Labelbox is a real world actual company. The employees that work there are all actual individuals. So that is real actual data. Now, if we were to generate a data set for for a made up company called Foo, and that company does not exist, and let's say it's a multinational company, Foo Incorporated, with 50 offices around the world, with 50,000 employees, it's all made up. That company does not exist. So that's a synthetic data set. Now, we have to make sure that when generating this data set, it's not completely garbage. So what I mean by that is that if it has 50% the names of employees that are alphanumeric, that would make no sense whatsoever, because people's names are not alphanumeric. So making sure that synthetic data is actually somewhat representative of real actual data, that's extremely important. And I can give you an example. So NVIDIA, they put out some large language models not too long back, they're metronome models, and they actually use synthetic data to train their models, along with real world data as well. Now, what they did is very clever, and I think that's excellent, is they used human in the loop with reward models to actually make sure that the generated synthetic data that they trained their large language model on was not garbage. So it made sure that the synthetic data itself is high quality. So synthetic data is data that is not actually existing in the real world, but so that it is of some quality, it has to have some representation, some representative of real world data, even though it is not actually real world data.
Okay, thank you for that. And I want to ask you just more on your personal leadership journey. As you look back, what are some of the most significant challenges that you faced in your own personal leadership journey, and how has that shaped your approach to leading in your role now?
Right. So I think, to answer this question, I would go back to when I first got promoted to a leadership role in an engineering leadership track. I got promoted from being a strong individual contributor. So unfortunately, I was still in the individual contributor mode, and I was under the impression that, okay, I'm responsible for delivering this project. I'm responsible for this team. So if people are not being able to ramp up, I'll do the work myself. Now, in hindsight, that was a very naive way of thinking about it, because in leadership roles, it is important to make sure that I'm mentoring and coaching people to be successful. If somebody is not pulling their weight, it's important to identify why is not happening and provide support and guidance to that person to make it happen. So as a leader, I don't have to do everything, but I have to identify the right people who can make things happen. And it's also important for me to identify the gaps that may be preventing somebody from making things happen, that may be preventing somebody from reaching their potential. So, in some aspect, I think as a leader, people have to be kind of part psychologists as well, being able to understand why somebody is doing what they're doing, or why somebody is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and making the best case judgment in those scenarios. So I think transitioning from an individual contributor to an engineering leader back in the day, that was one of the challenges I faced.
I think that's a very valid challenge that most leaders, most people face. They're doers. And I would guess that an engineer whose entire DNA is built up with fixing things and solving problems is probably even more challenging to go from a direct contributor to a leader, because you just want to fix something. When someone comes to you with a problem, half of your job is actually to help them solve the problem on their own and develop their skills. But your mindset as a former direct contributor yourself and an engineer problem solver is probably just to dive right in there and solve it for them. And that is a challenge for a lot of leaders, but I would guess especially an engineer.
Right. And it's a typical pitfall a lot of people fall into, especially when somebody who's an individual contributor gets promoted to a leadership role. But, I think I've learned my lesson since then. So I think I'm in a better place now.
Yeah, it's a challenge. How do you choose the next leaders that, like when you're looking at your group, what are some characteristics you look for? Because a lot of organizations, let me kind of frame this correctly, a lot of leaders promote by you're very good at your technical skills, so you get promoted. But no one's taking the time to see if you're also have the ability to lead others. So what are some of the things you look at as a leader besides their technical skills before you promote someone?
Right. Well, I have to emphasize that for somebody to get into leadership role in engineering, particularly in my organization, you have to be technically strong, because it is extremely difficult, in my opinion, for an engineering leader to be successful if they do not understand the technicalities of things. So that's a given. Now, besides that, I think they have to have a sense of ownership. They have to have a sense of empathy for their colleagues. They have to have a sense of being able to track and deliver on multiple threads. Because in engineering leadership, it very rarely happens at all that somebody has to work on one single work stream within a project. All right, I'll just work on this for this 2 weeks and get it done, or work on this for the next 2 months and get it done. The norm typically is that you have to be multi-threaded. You have to think about multiple things. You have to interact with different people. You have to manage stakeholders. You have to think about project delivery dates. You have to think about technical challenges. You have to also help unblock the engineers in your team when they run into technical problems. So being able to handle and manage these multiple threads, that's a skill I look for. Having a sense of empathy, I look for that as well, because there are a lot of leaders in the industry who, in my opinion, are basically just slave drivers. I'm not a big fan of that. I think it is important to deliver on things, but at the same time, it's also important to have a sense of empathy and then understand how can I encourage the engineers in my team to deliver on things so that they feel that encouragement on their own without feeling that, hey, my manager is actually breathing down my neck, and if I don't deliver, I'm going to lose my job. I mean, that's a little unhealthy in my opinion. The other component I look for, the other attribute I look for is a calm and collected demeanor. This is a very tricky one, and I definitely try to make sure that I'm not biasing for personality traits here, but a somewhat methodical, a somewhat organized demeanor certainly helps in the industry, particularly in startups where people have to wear multiple hats and things are evolving in an extremely rapid fashion, especially in the AI domain currently.
What is something that you think the world needs to know right now about AI that maybe isn't talked about on an everyday basis?
Well, a couple of things I would say. I think there is a lot of apprehension about AI replacing human beings and so forth. I think that is completely misplaced, in my opinion, because right now AI is nowhere close to what we would call artificial general intelligence. I mean, AI as it currently functions is not even, in my opinion, at the level of, say, a 4 or 5-year-old child. Right now AI is still very probabilistic, where we have this transformer model running at the heart of a large language model, which basically predicts what the next word could be or should be when somebody asks a question, which is why it's very interesting. If you ask a question to some of these large language models, you can see sometimes that the longer an answer gets, sometimes the less reliable and more noisy the ending part or the second half of the answer gets, because it's basically predicting at the back end what it should spit out as the next word or the next expression. So AI is nowhere close to artificial general intelligence, so people should not be afraid of whether AI is going to replace humans or nothing of that sort. What AI will do is augment human endeavor. So it is extremely important for people to understand how they can be more successful in their daily jobs by leveraging AI. So that is extremely important. The other thing I would say is people should think about incorporating AI in curriculum as well, in academic curriculum as well, even for schools. I think in schools, what's happening right now, there is an apprehension, and rightfully so, that people would just ask a question to ChatGPT or Gemini, and then there's going to be all of these copy-paste problems. And that's a very valid apprehension, but at the same time, instead of approaching it in a kind of a quote-unquote antagonistic way, I think curriculum developers should approach it in a way where they can encourage students to leverage AI to provide reports in some way, or to leverage AI to do their research for their school projects. I am not sure if that's really happening, because what that'll do is that'll enable the next generation to think about AI, exactly as I said, as an enabler and as an enhancer for their day-to-day jobs.
I think you touched on something. I tell leaders, like when someone shows up in front of them in their office with a problem, the problem they're showing up with is rarely the real problem. And your job as a leader is to ask questions and peel back the onion and keep going deeper. And maybe that's an exercise that teachers can be using with students when they come back with a response from AI. Like, how can you follow your curiosity now, student, and go deeper? Like, what deeper questions can you come up with based on what the AI has provided for you? And maybe that'll be a way in helping train critical thinking for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And AI can also help people to generate structures and outlines of what they need to deliver on. AI can also help them to organize their thoughts. I mean, a lot of people struggle with organizing their thoughts. I mean, that's a very, human aspect of things. AI, in my opinion, is a very strong enabler in helping people organize their thoughts. One other thing I would like to mention, a lot of schools and universities nowadays use these AI detectors, quote unquote AI detectors, right? Where somebody will submit a report, they run it through AI. Unfortunately, I would say more than half of these AI detectors generate false positive. I mean, I have myself tested out multiple of these where I would write something out and just for satisfying my own curiosity, I would say, okay, let's see what an AI detector says. And more than half the time it will say this is generated by AI. But I know for a fact, I just wrote it out myself, including my own writing style, my own inflection points when I write things out and so forth. So it's very odd that, a lot of these false positives are being spit out and universities and schools are still using these things. So I think from a kind of a thinking about AI from an antagonistic point of view, there needs to be a thought about AI as an enabler and an enhancer.
That's excellent points. And what is something that our listeners would find interesting and fun about you that maybe wouldn't just show up in your day-to-day or on your LinkedIn profile? What's a fun fact?
That's probably the toughest question you asked me so far. Well, I love nature. I particularly enjoy the redwood forest in California. So I love to go on hikes here in the state parks around here in the Bay Area. I love to go up to Northern California, up to the tip close to Oregon and visit the redwood forest over there. I really feel a sense of incredible calm when I'm in nature, and particularly when I'm in one of those redwood forests. It just I feel a sense of peace and calm that I really feel anywhere. So I love nature. I like being out there. Yeah, that's probably something people won't see in my LinkedIn profile.
That's great, though. Now, maybe you can change your banner in your LinkedIn profile to be a picture of the redwood forest, and that'll give them that piece of you as well.
Yeah, it's a great idea, yeah.
So finally, I ask a closing question to everyone. As the people that follow my podcast already know, Care to Lead is my signature leadership system, and it's built on the foundation of 4 pillars: clarity, authenticity, responsibility, engagement. And I always ask my guests closing questions about one of these pillars. Today, I'd like to focus on clarity. And in your opinion, how important is clarity in leading a team through the complexities of AI development?
Extremely important. I would say it is critical. I mean, clarity is important for any leader, whether that person is, and by leader, I don't necessarily mean somebody whose job title is, say, engineering manager or director or VP. An individual contributor can also be a leader. So clarity means clarity of thought and clarity in conveying that thought. So having a clear understanding of what needs to be done, what the requirements are, what the constraints are, what can we deliver within a particular amount of time, that's important. And also conveying that in very clear and concise terms to one's organization so is also extremely important. I have seen situations when engineers, and this is true not just for engineers in any organization, when employees can just run around, like in a scatterbrain fashion because there is lack of clarity about what needs to be done. So it is critical for leaders to have clarity of thought in their own heads and also be very clear and concise in conveying that to their employees.
I think that's a really important point. For so many areas is getting your thoughts clear, because organizations in multiple levels struggle with communication. And
Right.
often the reason isn't because they're not communicating clearly. It's because they haven't taken the time to organize their thoughts and think
Right.
clearly and have clarity on what they even want to deliver out there. They just start talking. So that's a
Exactly.
very, very good point.
Right. I'd also say that in terms of organizing their thoughts, and then having clarity, what helps me sometimes is actually writing down my thoughts. Before I actually talk to somebody about it. If I write it down, at least in bullet points, that's incredibly helpful to me.
I tell leaders all the time for everything that they're doing, whether it's writing an email or getting on a phone call, write down just an outcome. Like, this is the outcome that I need from this call, or this is the outcome I need in this email. So as you do it, if you start going off in all these different areas that are, chasing rabbit holes or whatever, you can look back. Is this getting me toward that outcome, or is this a waste of time and energy? And that's a really good exercise to start getting clarity in our thinking. So thank you so much for joining us today, Manas. Your insights into AI are incredibly valuable to our listeners. And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Care to Lead. Because remember, leaders who care to lead. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for having me again.